Good morning. My name is Candace Prince. I'm with Green Hope Project. We're very excited to have Sunrise Movement here with us today. They're going to talk about breaking down the environmental crisis. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Hi, thank you. My name is Des. I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany or Britt. I use she, her pronouns as well. And we're here from Sunrise, El Paso. So thank you all so much for having us and for taking the time to be here. And if you're watching this after the scheduled time, I appreciate it and we appreciate it. And I hope that you all take a lot of things away from this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and do a land acknowledgement so that we can recognize the people who originally inhabited the lands which we are now using. So the El Paso region is the ancestral lands of the Mogollon Ornada culture, including peoples of the Puro Manso Tampachoa, Tiwa, Humano, Yaramuri, and Suma, as well as the nomadic Apache and Comanche people, and the Tiwa, who were displaced to El Paso from their home in northern Mexico. So yeah, the title of our presentation is going to be Breaking Down the Environmental Crisis. And basically what we were trying to achieve with this presentation is to kind of explore some common myths that exist within the climate movement, as well as explain where we as Sunrise and as individual environmentalists kind of come to the movement and the ideals that we try to represent in our organizing.
Yeah. Sorry. So thank you again, Des, for having that like land acknowledgement. That's really important. And yeah, so thank you for going ahead and doing that. So I figure that we start with some introductions just so that we can kind of like get to know where y'all are, but also so that we just kind of get to know each other just a little bit as much as we can, right, through Zoom and through this brief time that we have. So like we mentioned, my name is Britt. My pronouns are she, her. So you all can feel free to use the chat box to provide your name, pronouns, and then we actually do have an intro question for you all. So it's pretty broad, right? It's pretty broad and like not very specific. So you can think about like the first thing that you think of, you can write the first thing that you think of, or maybe something that you're passionate about, like whatever it is that you know about the climate crisis. So yeah, if you all just kind of want to go ahead and add that to the chat box. Yeah, so I think like, what have you heard about the climate crisis? Sometimes I feel like when I was first introduced to the climate crisis, it was through like kind of veganism. I think for me personally is kind of how that introduction was. So I think that would kind of be my answer for that. So that's just kind of one example of that. So if you all want to go ahead and share that someone mentioned that we have limited time. Sorry, I'm reading the chat, to reverse damage. Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
I can also share mine. Again, my name is Des, pronouns she, her. When I came to environmentalism, I was actually very young and I watched a documentary about landfills being overfilled, and it like emotionally scarred me. I was depressed for like 2 days afterwards as a young child learning about that. So that was really interesting. When I was little, I really was into like recycling and trying to get my family to reduce their waste and stuff. And then since then, I've like grown to learn so much about how the climate crisis is so big and really impacts every part of our life, even outside of the waste we produce. Yeah, that was my experience with it.
Yeah, thanks, Des. And I think like a lot of us can relate in terms of like how the kind of impact, like the emotional and like mental impact that has on us, like realizing that. I see a lot of good comments in the chat though. So first of all, nice to meet you, Sulema. Someone mentioned that there's a political divide. I first came through feminism. That's really interesting. That food is an important part of that. Yeah. A lot of these are like great, and like I think a lot of common things that we hear. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing. And it's so nice to meet you all. Thank you for being here on a Sunday morning too. Yeah, so like going through the presentation, you know, hopefully we'll kind of touch on like a couple of the things that y'all have mentioned. And hopefully we can go a little bit into more depth with that. And feel free, like if you all have questions, if there's anything that you want to know more information about, like feel free to just go ahead and like ask, unmute yourself, put it in the chat box. Like, yeah, like we're just here to also have that conversation with y'all if you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're also not professing to know all of the answers. These are a lot of things we have discussions about pretty commonly in Sunrise. So even for those who are watching after the video, please feel free to always reach out to us in Sunrise. And we are always constantly having these conversations and trying to figure out where we stand on them and how we can fit in.
So just to kind of give you all a little bit more information about Sunrise. So before we kind of jump into like the nitty gritty, we want y'all to kind of know a little bit more about who we are and where we stand. So we presented in the summit before, and that was presented by Angel. So if you all like are able to find the recording for that one, you all can check that one out. It kind of talks about this, but a little bit more in depth. So very brief about Sunrise. We're a youth-led environmental organization. So very specific, right? We recognize that youth are going to be the primarily ones impacted by, and are being like the primary like people impacted by this climate crisis. So we know that it's not youth exclusive. We know it's not just youth, but we recognize that it's important to amplify youth voices, which is why we are youth-led. So El Paso and Sunrise El Paso is just one hub within a network of hubs all over the US. So there's like Sunrise Movement, and then there's different hubs scattered throughout the entire US. And I want to say like even outside of the US, I'm sure that there's like different Sunrise hubs. So again, just kind of some bullet points on our hub's values. And we usually spend like a good slide like on each of these values and points, but of course, this presentation is not necessarily about that specifically. So our hub's values, some of them are intersectionality, hub autonomy, voting is only one tool in the toolbox, climate crisis is a structural crisis, mainstream political movements have failed us. So like I said, we could spend a lot of time, and I think you'll see a lot about what we mean by intersectionality, realizing that the climate crisis isn't just about one singular issue, but it's about multiple issues. So I think you'll see that throughout this presentation. We hope that you do. Hub autonomy basically just means that we as Sunrise El Paso will function very different from Sunrise Movement and other hubs throughout the US because our issues are not the same. We're very different demographically, geographically, right? So it's important that we have our own autonomy because the issues are not going to be exactly the same. And then of course, voting is only one tool in the toolbox. Just basically kind of addressing that there are so many ways to approach this issue, and it's important to kind of acknowledge all of them. Hopefully you kind of get the climate crisis, a structural crisis again through this presentation. And then you'll kind of see like how we take a look at how mainstream political movements have failed this throughout this as well. Alrighty, so just to kind of start off, the way that we kind of broke this presentation up is starting off, like Des mentioned at the beginning, we're gonna kind of go through like some myth busters. So we start off with myth and then the fact, right? So the myth is we need to take care of planet for future generations. And I don't know how many of y'all have heard this, and I can tell you that I feel like I've been hearing that my whole life, and I'm still pretty young, like, but now I'm 20, right? So it's like, I used to always hear like, oh, in 30 years, right? Like in 30 years this and in 30 years that. And it's like, well, I've been hearing that like my whole life. So it's like, at this point, I don't know exactly what that means, right? So I feel like that's a myth that we often hear, like it's a future issue. And the fact is that climate change has been here since colonization. It's not a problem for the future. It's happening right now, and we are running out of time. So basically, the climate crisis is like demands just an incredible level of like immediate action. And that's why it's so important for us to implement climate justice within like all kind of like social justice movements, because they are all interconnected. So basically what that means is that it's not something that we need to like, oh, in 5 years, I'll start focusing on that and I'll start doing work for that. We don't have that much time anymore. We don't have that luxury. There are multiple studies that say by 2030, like if we are still doing fossil fuels, period, like we're going to be in big trouble. And I've recently heard about like different studies that by the end of this year, like we have to stop those things because we're at such huge risk of our planet getting hotter and about this climate crisis getting a lot worse. So it's no longer an issue for the future, right? And it kind of goes, I kind of want to touch on that first sentence, right, at how it's been here since colonization. And kind of to be more specific, like climate change has happened as a result of that, right? Like as a result of colonization as well. So basically, right, like people going into indigenous lands and colonizing not only the people, but also the environment that they're on, right? And then this definitely ties into like a later slide that we have that's more specific to capitalism, right? So how colonization and capitalism work together, and how we can see that it's not just an issue of the future, but that it's been happening. And it's kind of been, the way that I see it, it's kind of been like leading up to that, right? So there's kind of been like a starting point, and it's gotten so bad because of colonization, because of all of these other actions that and we'll kind of talk about it, like different powers have done in order for it to be this bad. So it's kind of been like inevitable for us to get like, for it to be that bad because of all of the actions that have been taken. So again, if you feel like that doesn't really make sense, or if you have additional questions, please feel free to ask them. Like Jess said, we're willing to like have these conversations, because I mean, a lot of this information we know from, we like to read and like do research, but a lot of it is kind of listening to people from other parts of the world, from the global South, and from different countries who are primarily affected, who are at the forefront of being affected by these issues. So like it's important to have those conversations. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Des.
Yeah, that was really great. And I agree with everything you said. I wanted to add a little bit more specifically about the first sentence about colonization. I think Britt was very right in how she laid out that the economic and social and political structures that were set by colonization are inherently what led to the situation we're in now, because they incentivize this sort of destructive and extractive processes. But there were also very real, like tangible destruction that was caused to the land immediately when colonization occurred. So it wasn't just about the economic structures, but it was also about bringing invasive species to places where they didn't belong, about establishing monocultures of agriculture where there used to be a variety of different agricultural crops that were grown. There's also, there was a specific story I was thinking of when you were talking about that, where until the late 19th century, there was this ecological theory that was developed in Northern Africa in the desert region, where essentially European settlers came and they thought that the reason that Northern Africa was a desert was because of poor management of the land by the indigenous African people there, because they were European and there isn't a lot of deserts in Europe. And so they thought, well, this should look like Europe, but it doesn't. It's a desert. So obviously they mismanaged the land. And as a result of that, that kind of got spread to different parts of Asia and India and different parts of the world, where those sort of like colonial views of what ecologically land should look like was touted as being scientific knowledge, because that was a European understanding of how ecological lands should be managed. And that led to a lot of colonial governments essentially making land management practices that tried to make the land look like Europe, even though, as we know now, it's very common scientific knowledge now that deserts aren't deserts because they're mismanaged. They're deserts because they are supposed to be deserts. So, yeah, I just wanted to also outline that there are very specific, like tangible examples of how colonization really destroyed like a lot of indigenous people's relationship to their land and what the land was supposed to be like. Yeah, so the next one we're going to talk about is there are no easy or capitalist solutions. This is a big one, and there are so many things that we can talk about within this. The myth that we put for this is not actually a statement, it's just a list of things. We put Elon Musk, geohacking, and Snowpiercer, which is maybe to some people a kind of random list of things that might not make sense, but hopefully you'll understand what we mean by the end of it. I don't know if you want to start off. Britt, do you want to give us an overview of what Snowpiercer is?
Sure. So Snowpiercer is a really good movie by the same director from Parasite. So if you've seen that one, same director, same kind of concept, right? So Parasite, if you all remember, was like pretty deeply about like classism. So Snowpiercer is pretty much, it is about classism, but it's also about like the climate crisis. So in a nutshell, like I don't think it's a spoiler, but I guess like spoiler alert warning. But Snowpiercer like starts off with basically like the planet got so bad with like climate change and the environment that they ended up releasing like some kind of emissions in the atmosphere to like in order for like humans to survive is basically what it is. So they kind of messed with like the atmosphere. So it ended up backfiring on them, and basically like the whole, from what it seems like, the whole earth became frozen. So now humans can only live in like this train that goes like in a literal loop. Like it just goes in a loop, and that's the only place that the people can live because everything else is frozen outside of the train. So at the back of the train, there's like who you'd imagine, like they're the poor people, right, of the train. Like they work all day and they get like really terrible food. And then as you move to the front of the train, like you can clearly see that like the richer people are or like the middle class, right? And then like the 1%. So it's like, that one's like really obvious. You can kind of see like the classism. And then of course that happened as a result of like how bad the environment got. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Snowpiercer is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. So obviously this is an example of fiction, Snowpiercer, but I think it's a really good illustration, and why a lot of environmentalists watch it is because it's a really good illustration of how something that we now kind of colloquially refer to as geohacking can turn out. So geohacking is kind of the like informal term for something that's also called geoengineering and other related practices that are basically these sort of techno solutions to environmentalism. So they kind of come from the ideology that we don't necessarily have to change the way that we live or the amount that we consume. We just have to kind of technologically invent our way out of this problem. And these can come in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about Elon Musk and green and technologies and stuff right now, but also specifically as is the example in Snowpiercer, there has been these propositions by lots of people to do things like shooting aerosols into the atmosphere in order to try and cool down the Earth's temperature, or also doing things like planting forests in deserts, which is kind of going back to the story I was just telling, doesn't really work out when you plant plants that don't belong there. Or also doing things like fertilizing the ocean in order to increase like photosynthesis within the photosynthetic organisms in the ocean and things like that. And so I won't get into specific scientific examples, but we do have kind of like a resource section at the end of our presentation if you want to go and look through them. There's some articles included there of how studies recently have looked into these sorts of geohacking technologies and found that like the Earth, as it turns out, is a very complex place. And so you can't just go shooting things into the atmosphere and think that it's going to cool down the Earth. Maybe it will for a little while, but it will have probably enormously unpredictable and destructive consequences that we wouldn't be able to calculate because of how many factors there are in how the Earth's ecosystem functions. And so that's just something that maybe someday there will be a place in which we are at an extreme emergency and we decide that we need to try and grow forests or something like that, but it's just really not the solution that we should be relying on. I think we should just we shouldn't approach our environmentalism with the idea that we can rely on technology to engineer our way out of this without fundamentally changing how we relate to our ecosystem. And so moving on to the next one. So that's kind of there are no easy solutions part of this myth. And then the next one is there are no capitalist solutions. So you will hear a lot of environmentalists nowadays. I think it's become more of like a buzzword and people talk about it a lot about capitalism and how it's led to a lot of the problems that we face today. And so I think one of the best examples of this when I think about this for me is how when you approach an environmental solution through a capitalist lens, it can often lead to more destruction and harm and doesn't necessarily always yield the product that we want. And so we use this example of Elon Musk. He's a very, very well-known figure today for his company Tesla that produces cars as well as other lithium-ion batteries. And there are a lot of things to be said about Elon Musk, but essentially some of the foremost problems that I think about when I think about Elon Musk is that one of the things that his company pushes a lot is the production of these lithium-ion batteries. And so lithium-ion batteries are a sort of battery technology that we could use in order to store energy that's produced from renewable energy, which in theory sounds like a good thing, right? And it could be. It's necessary for us to have battery storage in order to have renewables because the sun doesn't shine all day long and because wind doesn't blow all day long. We need to have a way to store this energy. But the problem with this is that the way that capitalism functions is that it doesn't necessarily produce things that people always need. You know, the goal of capitalism isn't to produce what people need, it's to produce profits for someone, whoever the capitalist is. And so today we extract tons of these rare metals. Lithium is just an example, but there's also rare metals like cobalt that get extracted a lot of times in South American or African countries by people who get paid very low wages or sometimes nothing at all, and can often destroy the environment. And this has a lot of this has obviously environmental consequences, but also political consequences. And so that's why we have this tweet here on the screen, is that essentially when you have these large resources in these poorer nations, it incentivizes wealthier nations that want to kind of green their economies to go into these poorer nations to extract the resources. And that's how you would wonder why Elon Musk, who runs a electric car company, would be interested in the coup in Bolivia. Well, it's because in Bolivia, that's one of the world's, it's part of what is known as the lithium triangle in South America, where 50% of the world's lithium resources are found. And so Elon Musk is saying in this tweet, we can coup whoever we want, meaning that from the capitalist point of view, you can interfere in the governments and lives of other people, regardless of what impacts it has for them, essentially for your capitalist intentions. And so that's why we sort of are always skeptical of these capitalist solutions, because something that appears to be good, you know, like we are in favor of having solar panels, we are in favor of having renewable resources. But when we do it in this way, where we don't consider what the social and cultural and just human consequences of our resource extraction is, then we just end up hurting people and causing more environmental harm.
Yeah.
So there's also a lot more to say about Elon Musk and why he's deeply mistrusted by environmental organizers. But I think that's kind of the overview of why we feel very skeptical of that. So this next slide kind of goes along with the previous one. It's very related, and it's decreasing the need for energy. And so this is kind of, it's directly from the previous slide about so if we don't have, what Elon Musk does and other people who try to push these renewable energy resources without considering the underlying causes of our problems, we refer to that as sort of green capitalism, which is the belief that we just need to transition our energy sources to renewable energy without fundamentally changing any of our economic or political structures. And as I explained before, and as Britt kind of touched on with the colonization slide, is that these structures that we have inherently incentivize the destruction and extraction of nature. And so we not only need to transition our energy away from fossil fuels, but we need to do it in a way that completely reimagines our society. And in addition to being mindful about how we source these renewable energies, we also need to decrease our demand for energy. And so there are a lot of statistics out there that you can find about how much so-called first world countries contribute to carbon emissions and other sorts of environmental harms as compared to people in not rich countries, in poorer countries. And so that it really highlights the ways in which the richer countries of the world use a disproportionate amount of energy and cause a disproportionate amount of environmental harm, and have been doing so for many years, especially coming after the Industrial Revolution. And so when we are just trying to transition away from fossil fuels while still using the same amount of energy, that is in a lot of ways a sort of unrealistic goal, because there are a lot of complications that come with producing energy. Even as we saw in the previous slide, even in renewable ways, there are so many complications that if we continue to use the same amount of energy without, even renewables will not allow us to use that same amount of energy without still continuing to cause environmental harm. So yeah.
Yeah. And kind of just to add on to that, I think in this particular slide, that's kind of where we see the structural part of it, right? And really how the problem isn't that capitalist, dirty capitalism, right? And that we need to make it green. The point is that capitalism is bad, period. And like Des said in the previous slide, I really like how you worded it and how you said it's not, capitalism doesn't serve what people need, it serves profits, and it serves how those people want to make money, people like Elon Musk, right? And the people that we think of the 1%, those people are capitalists, right? Because they're the ones who are completely benefiting from the extraction of resources in other countries, and that are benefiting from unpaid and overworked people, right? So I think that's kind of with this particular slide, that's really where we kind of see that we need a drastic change in the economic structures. We need a drastic change to how these things function, in order to kind of make sure that we're okay and that our planet's okay, really is kind of how I see it. But alrighty, so going a little bit more into that and into structures and those kinds of things. So talking about environmentalism, war, military, and imperialism. So I know that's a lot of words, and this is in and of itself something huge to kind of tackle. So it's a myth that climate justice can exist alongside war, military, and imperialism. And it is a fact that there is no climate justice with those things. And the next slide kind of goes into that, and we'll break it down for sure. But kind of an example for that is, and you can go ahead and change the slide, Des. So this is kind of why environmentalism must be anti-war and anti-imperialism at its core. Like there is no ifs, ands, or buts on this. So first, U.S. military runs on fossil fuels. So a lot of this information is taken from the National Priorities Project. They have a lot of, basically like they're at their root, like what they do is they pretty much just pay attention to how, I believe it's specifically the US, how they spend their money. So obviously when it comes to US money, like war and the military is one of like the biggest, right, thing to look at. So one of the things that they were talking about is how a lot of times we think about greening the military and making it green and making like the airplanes and helicopters and like all of the equipment that they use like non-fossil fuels and making it like with renewable energy and renewable resources, right? But that leaves out a huge part of what we've been talking about, and what's core to like intersectionality is that it's not that we want like green military, it's that we don't want wars and we don't want imperialism. We don't want the US military to be in different countries in the world and extract resources from them, coup their governments, and like do all of these other things, right? That, like Des mentioned, harms them on a just like a humanitarian level, but also culturally, economically, politically, like all of those issues are interconnected with how the US military intervenes in their locations. So an example of this is Department of Defense gives excess equipment to police. So another way that like the climate justice is connected to other issues within the US is the militarization of other entities. So there's actually a Department of Defense, like basically like a rule, I think, and I have the exact number somewhere, but it basically says that like any excess equipment that they're not using, that they don't need, they give it to like police, right? So basically what that means is that then they're able to use that for their own use. And that's how we kind of have a more militarized local police, right? So I will like also go ahead and add that I think like that's very specific to El Paso, right? Like we have Fort Bliss, like, and I want to say they're one of like I forgot like the exact, like exactly what it's called, but I know they're like one of the biggest, like, I think, in terms of like planes, I think they have like, it's like a central place. I don't know exactly what the terms are, so I won't go into that. But we can kind of see how that would definitely like militarize our border patrol and also like our own El Paso Police Department. So yeah, like I think that's, we as El Paso like are very obvious, I think, example of that. And then, of course, another point is that military bases all over the world have displaced people there. So we have over like 800 military bases in different parts of the country. And some of them, I think, like, we're just kind of like, what are we even doing over there? Like what, why do we need to be over there? And I know that that's kind of like, might seem like, I don't know, like, I don't know what y'all think about that question, but sometimes I just think about that, like, what do we have business like doing over there, right? So, right, like that harms the environment, that harms the people there, it militarizes their locations, their homes, right? And it displaces them. They get pushed out of their homes in order for them to build a base there. And then there's climate migration, right? So climate migration is then often seen as a national security issue, right? Like I think we've recently seen over the past couple of years is whenever like the results of the climate change, right, is a lot of people experience loss of, like, they experience crop failures, right? So as the planet gets warmer, as climate change happens and the climate becomes extremely unpredictable, people who grow, food, they grow crops, then they stop being able to grow as much because of the damage that has been done to their environment. So what ends up happening is, well, they have no other choice than to migrate, right? Than to move, because they're no longer making the money. They're no longer making like a living off of their land, right? So they have to move. So then that's a direct consequence, right, of the climate crisis. So going back to what Des mentioned about how the US and like richer countries are the main people, right, are the main entities that cause climate change, that cause this climate crisis to be as bad as it is. And the people that are at the forefront experiencing that are not as rich countries, right? And it's people in the global south, and they're people of color, they're Black people, they're people who are, again, like at the forefront of all of those issues. So what that does is that creates, well, if they have to migrate, right, because they have no other choice, then we, like as the US, right, tend to then have like a very militarized perspective on it, and like see it as a national security issue, where really, right, had we not been polluting, had we not been like doing all of these, extracting resources from their countries, like it wouldn't be this bad, and they wouldn't have a need to migrate. So yeah, that kind of fits into like how at the forefront we must be anti-war and anti-imperialism. Like it's not enough to just want renewable resources. Another example of this, and you all can kind of go ahead and like look it up, but I believe one of Elizabeth Warren's plans, I don't know if it was I believe it was during her campaign, but it was like to green the military, right? And again, it just kind of goes to show back to like how mainstream political movements fail us so very often, is that sounds good, right? Like you might go to that website and be like, okay, that sounds like a good idea, right? Like, okay, greening the military, making sure that they don't like use as many fossil fuels. But at the end of the day, at the core of it, like people are still being killed in other countries. At the forefront, like there are still Black and brown people being displaced and being killed by what is like the US military, right? So again, that's why we kind of have to think about all of these things and see how they're all interconnected, and that it's not just the climate crisis. That cannot be a separate issue, or we will lose, because all of these things are connected, and we just can't go about thinking that some people are disposable. Like that's not how the climate crisis will that's not how we will like find climate justice. We have to look at it through all of those lenses.
I did want to like kind of tie it back to what we were talking about earlier about reducing the amount of energy we use. It also kind of like leads you to think about like what is it that right now we're using our energy to do? Because if you tell people you need to reduce your energy consumption, or you should reduce your consumption, they think, oh, well, I don't want to have to give up my air conditioner or something like that. But I think it's also like we have to take a critical examination of like how much energy are regular people using on a daily basis, and like where is that energy being used? Because if it's being used to occupy different countries around the world, like is that where we want to prioritize our limited amount of carbon that we can expend? Yeah, and that was a really interesting question that you asked about like what are we doing over there. I think it's always an interesting question to ask, like why does the United States have 800 military bases, and how would we react if there was another country that had that many military bases? Like why is the United States the exception to having the military occupy the entire world? So the next one, overpopulation and tragedy of the commons. This one can kind of be highly contested among some environmentalists. I do still see a lot of environmentalists talking about overpopulation and being in support of this narrative of population control. And like I said at the beginning, we're not necessarily saying that we have all the answers, and I have heard people whose voices that I typically trust say we need to control population, but from my personal point of view and what we tend to talk about in Sunrise, it is my understanding that population control is a a very dangerous narrative to be pushing. And so that's why we are kind of taking this stand of being against the idea of overpopulation as a primary environmental threat. And so obviously the myth here is that there are too many humans on the planet, and this also manifests itself in different ways that people speak, such as saying things like human are the virus of the real virus of the planet, which is something that you saw people talking about a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, the fact that we present here is overpopulation is a Malthusian ideology, or / Malthusian ideology is ecofascism, or can lead to ecofascism. And so for those who don't know, ecofascism is a type of kind of political ideology that a lot of actually like terrorists use as their justification for why they are killing people. And it basically says that like there are too many people on the planet, and so I need to kill people so that there are less people on the planet, so we have enough resources for everybody. And the reason I put Malthusian ideology here is because a lot of overpopulation, a lot of conversations we have about overpopulation comes from, I believe his name was Thomas Malthus, who originally talked about how no matter what, as humans grow, we will always outgrow our resources that we have available. And this has been a very, even if you haven't heard the name Thomas Malthus, you've probably heard of his ideology because it's become very pervasive, even in like environmental sciences, it's very commonly taught. And that's really interesting because actually Thomas Malthus has been disproven several times. Today we produce way more than enough food for all the people that exist today. And so that, you know, in itself proves that Malthus was wrong when he said that we would not be able to produce enough food as the population grew. And so this is just something that's been kind of misproven in a lot of ways over and over again as we continue to produce enough food for the population we have. And obviously it's not in the most sustainable way, but we are able to do it. And actually we throw away a ton of the food that we produce. So we produce way too much food. We could probably stand to produce less food. It's more about the way that we distribute resources than it is about having the availability of resources. And so there are a lot of ways in which this overpopulation ideology has been disproven because we do have the resources available for people. However, there are still some people who say like, as the population continues to grow, at someday we won't have enough resources. And to that, I would say that even if that is a possibility, it doesn't necessarily outweigh the negative consequences, which are that these overpopulation conversations tend to lead to lots of harmful effects. And it's not just in these extreme examples of terrorism, it's also in the policies that people enact all over the world. The very famous one is the one-child policy in China, but also there is a long history throughout the world, and including in the United States, of often people of color being sterilized. And it has happened to this day. People are still claiming that it happens commonly in ICE detention centers. And so for me, the way that I see this overpopulation conversation is that there will never be a way in which the benefits of talking about overpopulation outweighs the harms of often people of color and disabled people of the global South, being sterilized or being killed in the name of sustainability. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Britt.
Yeah, thank you for tying that example in. Like, I think that really paints the picture of like how the harms outweigh like whatever benefits we could possibly have with that ideology. But I think also, like, to kind of add on to that is how anti-Indigenous that is. Like, there is a long history of like you mentioned, right, communal caretaking, and who is that history? Like, those are Indigenous people that have like historically, like, they're the ones who protect the land, the natural resources that exist today in the US. Like, they're really the ones protecting any kind of natural resources we have. So the idea that like it's one, like overpopulation is an issue, like that completely neglects all of the work that Indigenous people have been doing since like the beginning of time, right? Like we're not using the resources the way that they need to be used. And I think like, again, at the forefront is like Indigenous people are the primarily ones that are being harmed by these kinds of ideologies, and their practices and their labor is being completely erased. And again, whatever resources we have, like we owe to Indigenous communities and people fighting for them. So there's also that layer to it, I think. And it kind of goes into like, I think the next slide where we'll kind of talk more about like the Red Deal and Indigenous people and their fight in the climate crisis.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can go over tragedy to the commons really quick, and then it'll lead us into.
Oh yeah.
So the tragedy to the commons is something that's also very commonly taught throughout environmental science. For those who don't know, I'm an environmental science student at UTEP, so this is coming from a lot of things that I've been taught in my environmental science classes that I didn't necessarily agree with. So tragedy of the commons was something that I was taught, and it's essentially this idea that if lands are left as public lands, meaning that there is no government or private entity in charge of them, that they will inevitably lead to ruin because people will take resources from the land until there's nothing left, essentially. And this goes back exactly to what Britt just said, which is that this completely ignores a long history of Indigenous peoples who manage the land and who to this day continue to manage the land. And so this idea that communally managed lands or public lands will inevitably be destroyed is just not true from what we've seen through historical knowledge. Which leads us to the next slide, which I wanted to highlight this statement that's written on this page, which says that Indigenous people make up only 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of the planet's biodiversity. So a lot of times we tend to talk about Indigenous people in history as if they don't exist anymore, but they do exist still today. And even though they only make up 5% of the world's population, they protect an enormous amount of our planet's land still. And so that's why I think, going back to the previous slide also, that a lot of people will still try and push these narratives very commonly in environmental justice today. But I think that trying to push those narratives really does ignore the long history of Indigenous people caretaking for our land. And so with this slide, we really just wanted to urge anyone who is watching this to look into what is called the Red Deal. So this was a plan that was launched by the Red Nation, which is a group of Indigenous people in the United States. And the Red Deal is not necessarily like a counter to the Green New Deal. It's just, as they describe it, it goes further than the Green New Deal in incorporating how Indigenous knowledge and specifically decolonization is important to an environmentally just world.
So this is one of the things that like we as Sunrise, because it's a fairly new book, like we're also working on reading it and then seeing what that looks like and how do we implement this. So again, like Des and I, like Des and I, but also we Sunrise, like we don't know everything. So we definitely invite you to like have these conversations with us. If you have questions, if you have a different perspective, if you have a different input, like that's what it's all about. Like we're all here in El Paso, right? Like we all have different perspectives of what we need, right, for our communities. So yeah, like come, like if you want to join Sunrise, we're like reading this book together and like, yeah, just kind of learning from it and seeing how that's going to reflect in the work that we do. So you're always welcome.
Yeah, and the actual plan of the Red Deal is available online for free by the Red Nation, which you can also find in our resources list at the end. But you can buy the book copy. I have it here. It's a cute little book. It's not that big, not that long. But yeah, so I would encourage anyone to check it out if you are interested in learning more about these decolonized ideas of environmental justice.
Thank you so much, guys. Hey, if anybody's interested in finding out more about Sunrise or contacting you, how would they do that?
So I think, is it on our last slide?
Yes.
It is
Oh,
here.
no. Okay, do your thing. Sorry.
Yeah, we were just gonna have a quick conversation, but then we can put up that slide right now. So we wanted to talk very quickly about, as I hope everyone knows what's going on in Palestine right now. Even if you aren't an expert, I'm sure you've seen that Israeli forces within the last 2 weeks or so really heightened their attacks on Palestine and their efforts to remove Palestinians from their homes. And I think a lot of the times people might say, like, for environmentalists, you spend a lot of time not talking about the environment, but I think that's actually really important. Like, that's what it's about, because the environment affects everything. And so we were wondering, we just wanted to kind of have a conversation with the people here in this group, and also for those of you watching later, to try and challenge you to think about this global movement for the liberation of Palestine and how you imagine that the struggle is related to environmental justice. Because for us, it is very intrinsically linked to our struggle for environmental justice. And so if anybody wants to unmute or drop it in the chat, just your ideas of how you think the struggle for Palestinian liberation is related to environmental justice, or if you have any questions you want to ask about that.
And also, just to kind of let you all know, we were supposed to have this presentation yesterday, but we realized that it was at the same time as the El Paso for Palestine protest. So we did decide to postpone this presentation until today. So just to let you all know as well, kind of what happened with the schedule change, but also like how important it is, right, to stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Yeah, and the Instagram screenshot that we have here is of EP for Palestine, which are the group of Muslim teenagers that organized the event on their own, which is very inspirational to see them all there. And there was a lot of people that showed up. So we encourage you to follow EP for Palestine. They will be adding resources about Palestine and ongoing efforts to support the struggle for Palestinian liberation in El Paso in the future.
Yeah, and if you feel like you all like, maybe it's kind of difficult, right, for you to kind of connect to those two issues, and also like it depends on how much you know, as well of like what's going on in Palestine. But you can also think back to like the slides that we just introduced to you all, and like kind of how you think those things fit in. Even if you feel like it's a long shot, it honestly probably isn't. Like you're probably on the right track.
Hello, my name is Gia. I just wanted to chime in, and I think from my perspective, farmers there and the community, they're going to have to think in the future about exposure to all these weapons and explosives that on the land. So I think that's related to that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One that I would add on to there that is related to that, Gia, is that I've heard a lot about how Israel controls the water that flows into Palestine. That has affected farmers, because obviously if you don't have water, you can't farm. It's a somewhat arid region, and so if you don't have that added water, then it's very difficult and pretty much impossible to do your agriculture there. And so for me, that's kind of an example of going back to what we've been talking about at the beginning about colonization, of us watching Israel have this control on Palestinians is essentially us watching this colonization process in real time, and like how that is directly affecting their ability to sustain themselves and their own environment.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Angel. I put a comment in the chat. I've heard that the bomb materials, or just bomb manufacturers in general, the materials that they use harm the environment, such as like Lockheed Martin. And we had a conversation that I learned about Raytheon yesterday after the protest, after the march. And then another thing I learned at the march yesterday as well is that Palestine only gets 6 hours of energy a day, which is a control over an energy supply that we see at like more of a small scale level here in El Paso.
Thank you for that connection, Angel. And I do remember someone mentioning that yesterday, and yeah, like it just it goes into like exactly how you mentioned, like the issues that we kind of face here in El Paso and in Texas, right? Like the blackouts and all of those things are a result of like of the failure of our power grids and the privatization of all of those things as well. And again, like here in El Paso. So yeah, that's a really good connection.
Yeah, and also the part about the military, here in El Paso, specifically the UTEP, we have a lot of deep connections through Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and all of these arms producers. They directly make deals with UTEP in order to employ UTEP students and undergrads there. And so going back to Britt's all of their slides about how militarization is related to the climate justice movement, you can easily see the connection of how the United States, I forgot the word, sends a lot of their arms to Israel, you know? So yeah, Israel's military equipment comes from the United States and the technology comes from the United States. So there's a very clear connection there.
Yeah. And then there's also kind of going into that, like I recently learned that like the Israeli military also trains like our own police in the US. So like that's really eye-opening, right? Like you would, because I feel like people would think, right, like if they're not necessarily aware of like, well, that's a whole like other country, like that's a whole other side of the world, like they're facing different issues, like maybe they need that. But then when we find out that like they're being trained with the same kind of tactics here in the US, like that kind of puts it into perspective of like, you wouldn't think that you would need that level of like militarization, right? Like we shouldn't need it, period, right? But I'm saying from like that perspective of like, of trying to like understand why that is happening over there versus why it's happening here. But kind of goes to show that like we should advocate for the end of that period, right? Because I mean, that shouldn't be happening in the first place. But I mean, yeah, I think all of y'all are in the right track of like how those things are related.
I just wanted to comment. So the exposure that I am aware about would be like plutonium, radiation, and uranium. In regards to the environment, with the use of those that kind of weaponry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll like, I believe you, right? Like, I couldn't tell you like an exact resource for that, but I mean, I'm not surprised, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you all for entertaining us in this conversation. I think we really just wanted to like kind of give an example of, we have a lot of conversations like this within Sunrise of things that seem like they're not related to the environment, but really when you kind of trace it back to their root sources, they are, and sometimes it's not even that hard to find how they're related to the environment. And so anyone who's here with us or who is watching this later, we would kind of urge you to see to look at the problems around you that you see and see why it's so important for you to have solidarity with issues outside of environmentalism, if you consider yourself to be an environmentalist.
Yeah. And then also really quickly, sorry, just to kind of add on to this conversation, like we still encourage you to like follow them on Instagram and just kind of keep updated with what's happening in Palestine, because just because like a ceasefire was recently announced, it doesn't mean that like they're still not being colonized, they're still not being ethnically cleansed. It doesn't mean that people still aren't being displaced from their homes. Like that's still going to be an ongoing issue. So yeah, just kind of encouraging y'all to stay updated and to read up on these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And a ceasefire doesn't undo all the harm that was already done, right? So if you want to follow us or get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, apparently. And
yes, we have a podcast.
Oh, that's what that means. Okay. Yeah, we do have a podcast, and I think you can find that on any like listening services, like Apple, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we have a website. I believe it's sunriseelpasotexas.org. Is that a website? And then this website specifically, nonhuman6.com, is specifically dedicated to our current project to stop the construction of the Newman 6 power plant in Northeast El Paso. You can learn all about that at that website, and also the presentation that was given previously by Sunrise, I believe, talked in depth about Newman 6. So you can go back and look at that if you want to hear an explanation of that.
So when do you guys do your podcasts?
Randomly, sporadically. We don't release them on a schedule. It's just kind of whenever we find someone to interview or major events come up. I believe we released one recently about the March for Clean Air that we had about a month ago.
So I see in the chat we have the website is sunriseelpaso.org, right? And so just a question. I know that you said it's a movement with a lot of younger people. So are there age restrictions if anybody wants to reach out and collaborate with you, or?
No, not necessarily. The only thing we necessarily put age restrictions on is who is allowed to be like in the leadership positions, but we are always more than happy to work with anybody of any age. I think we consider the environmental justice movement to be one that is intergenerational. We deeply value the input of our elders. So no, definitely not. Any person of any age, feel free to reach out and talk to us.
So I guess before I open it up to questions or comments from anybody, just, like the troubles of the world, it can seem so overwhelming, and I just find it hard to watch the news because I carry it with me. And, if it's not the land, it's the animals, then it's the people, and then it's the air, and then it's the water. And then it's just like almost information at our fingertips is almost overwhelming, right? So what advice would you give for people who feel like they just want to make change, but they don't know where to begin? Or is there hope? Is there a solution? Like, what are solutions for this? Like, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. And I think like that's something that I think I struggle with like every single day, because it's really, really difficult to it's one, like, I think particularly like why we kind of make it youth focused and youth led is because it's exactly like Desiree said, like when she was young, right? Like she heard about it. And from there, it's like, I feel like a lot of youth now, we don't really have the luxury of like being youth and enjoying like things that we would normally do. Like we're constantly worried about all of these things that are going on, about how like in 10 years, like it's going to be so different if we don't act and we don't do something right now. So yeah, like it's difficult, like it's hard, right? But for me personally, what I've found is I'm like so grateful to Sunrise because I felt like less alone. Like every time that I hang out with them, every time that we even have a meeting, to me, it's like validating. I feel validated in like how stressed I am and how sad those things make me sometimes, and how frustrated, how angry. Like, so I don't get that sometimes with family. Sometimes I don't get that like in the places that I work. And I feel like I honestly didn't get that sometimes in like when I was in college, right? So I think for me, Sunrise has been very helpful because I feel validated in that sense, where like my anger and like my willingness to want to do something feels validated. But I also feel less alone. Like I found a group of people that if I don't have the capacity to do something, I know that Desiree, I know that other people in Sunrise will step up and do what needs to be done. And I also think it's important for people to realize that it's small things. Like you don't have to show up to city council like every time they have a meeting in order for like you to make change. Like it can be the small things. Like there's things like maybe typing up a document, taking notes for a meeting that we have, like all of those small things, like whatever people have the capacity for is worthy. Like it doesn't have to be some huge thing, some huge action that you take. Like it's the little things too, because at the core, like we have to value all labor, because we're also trying to reject those ideas, right? Of like what you produce is what you're worth. Like that's not it, right? Like you're worthy just by existing. You're worthy just by breathing. So like, yeah, we have to take into account that like we're all humans. We're not being paid to do this work. This work makes us stressed. It burns us out. It makes us angry. And part of like being able to resist another day is also being able to take care of yourself. So I think like we kind of try to tie that all in as like Sunrise and just me personally. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. Like I struggle with that too. Yeah, that was kind of a lot, but I don't know. Desiree, you can go ahead and.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I agree with everything you said. And I think it's so true that the youth of today, they have it rough. I'm not going to lie. You basically grew up today always aware of the bad things that are happening around you. And that's a lot to live with. And I especially feel for the people who are young right now living through the pandemic. They have so many just compounding factors that are making their lives difficult. But yeah, like I think for me, I would also just echo what Britt said about like finding your people, that it is such an amazing experience that you find people who, one, I mean, we do talk about a lot of like the bad things that are happening. We spend a lot of time talking about that stuff too, but it's also a very unique experience to have people, to be surrounded by people who are also trying to imagine a better world, because I think that's part of it too. Like we're not just trying to destroy and take down all of these harmful things. We're trying to build something better while we're doing it. And not only just for the future, but right now, like as Britt said, we prioritize ourselves and our joy and our well-being, and we try and really embody the world that we want to see for future generations. And so I think definitely just finding people that give you that hope for a better future, and always keeping in mind what we're actually fighting for is to create a better world. And it always makes me happy to think about future generations that are free, that don't, little children don't have to worry about the landfills and the turtles dying and everything. They could just be children. That's what keeps me going, is that I always do imagine that beautiful new world.
And I agree that, it can be debilitating at times when you feel so overwhelmed with everything that you almost are moved to inaction because you don't even know where to begin. But I think it's important that, like you said, anybody who's listening to this, live or later, that you are very aware that, inaction is never going to help anything except, internally you're just stuck. But education is huge. I know education is slow moving, but it's more permanent than quick fixes. So if you can get into people's minds, that stays much longer than anything external, right? Because if you get into people's minds, I believe that changes habits. And when you change habits, you change culture. When you change culture, like that just kind of piles, right? But I urge you, if you're watching or listening and you feel just as we do, that you do what they've said, is you find your tribe. You find your people who are like-minded, because then you have a support system, and you're stronger united than you are isolated. And you feed off that positive stuff from your tribe, and that propels you forward. But I also think that there's going to be a lot to say for invention and creation and innovation. So you may not feel like you're equipped to be an activist, or maybe you're super shy, or maybe you're not articulate, but maybe you're really amazing at math, and you might, invent something that replaces plastic waste. Maybe you are an incredible photographer, and you can document these things that are happening in the world to show it with other people. Like, Britt was saying, like, whatever little talent you may have, you may feel like it's not as important, but it is incredibly important, because everybody needs to come together with their strengths to pull this off, right? So even start in your own backyard, guys. El Paso needs your help. El Paso needs your help with the waste, the pollution, the illegal dump sites, some of the stuff that they've even touched on, with the land and the water. And so get involved locally. That's, just don't think, oh my gosh, I got to save the whole world. You saving El Paso is a part of that. Start here, take your baby steps. You can start here, and then you're going to be that inspiration for the next person, right? And I see in the chat, Veto says, Veronica Carbajal, yes, find your tribe. Thank you, Candy, Zulema, and Darlene, for leading GHP and amplifying the message and working alongside the youth. Thank you guys for taking the time to attend on a weekend. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you for everything you do. I'm going to shut up and see if anybody has any comments or questions. Would you like to say anything to Sunrise El Paso or ask anything?
Thank you for presenting here today, Desiree and Brittany.
Agreed. Thank you, ladies. Anybody else?
Yes, thank you, Des and Brittany, for this, but also all the work that Sunrise El Paso has been doing to just kind of electrify the conversation. And even though you've had to do it virtually this past year, you've been at it consistently and creating some really awesome social media messages, and staying on top of city council. So I so support all of your energy and your commitment. And it is incredibly awesome to see El Pasoans, especially brown El Pasoans, taking this on, because, you know, this is, like you said, this is now. And this movement is just growing and growing. So, and thank you to all of the teachers like Candy, you know, have just lit a fire under so many of their students. And so let's keep it moving and growing. So thanks to everyone for all you do.
Oh man, they have so much more energy and fire than I do. So I will pass it on because I am getting old and tired.
I hear you.
I know. I'm like, I'm so tired. But yeah, keep it going. Thank you guys. And you're very passionate. You're very articulate. You're informed. And so we appreciate your work. Guys, if you're interested in getting more information, you can see the slide is up there, and feel free to reach out to them. I think everybody would welcome any help, right? So thank you guys. Again, we have plenty more workshops. Please do register. We would love to have you. And we hope to have this environmental summit in person next year. So we hope you'll join us again.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, guys. Have a great Sunday.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.